to discuss this chapter, I think to follow up on the Arctic, it's time to put everything we have learned so far into some perspective, because now we have some idea of how all these different pieces put together to make one coherent story. Coherent story, I think it's necessary to understand this chapter, why the Middle East is here, why North Africa is here, and how we have to examine the Middle East, because the Middle East is really huge area, huge topic. But from what perspective? That is important. From what perspective do you have to study the Middle East and North Africa? That is important, which will be a little bit difficult to know. So to help you understand why we have to look at the Middle East now, let's put together what we have learned so far. We began with shale gas, right? The assumption is that shale gas is the beginning of every change. Because of this unconventional revolution, we looked into how economic and market changes, occurred because of these unconventional changes. So we looked into LNG market changes, and oil market changes, although more focus was on the LNG market and natural gas market changes. Then I think in the more recent classes, I don't know whether you recognize that. In the recent classes, I think our focus shifted from economic market changes to geopolitical changes, Geopolitical changes meaning great power relations, How Russia-U.S. relations shift, How European-Russian relations shift, and how U.S.-Asian, Northeast Asian relations, how Russian-Northeast Asian relations change. So more focus was on so-called security relations. So we studied both aspects in terms of the impact of shale gas, impact of shale revolution on both aspects. Market changes, impact on market changes, and second, impact on geopolitical changes, great power relations. And at the center of which, of all the great power changes, of all the geopolitical changes, Russia is at the center, Russia is at the center, because Russia, in many respects, clearly playing a central role, because it's sort of a superpower, still a superpower, technically, and also huge oil and gas producer, although it's outside the OPEC. So Russia still has a huge impact on the oil market, natural gas market, both aspects. So Russia is at the center. So we first looked into particularly the Ukrainian crisis, the impact, the implication of the Ukrainian crisis on the power of Russia, Russian-European power relations, It's still, the study is still ongoing on this aspect. So important, probably the most important aspect, European energy security and Russia, So I guess that we studied a little bit on this aspect, the shifting role of Russia and China as a consumer, China as a consumer. So I think these are the things that we have studied so far, which naturally leads to today's class, the Middle East. How would the Middle East fit into all this? We need to think about it. How the Middle East and North Africa fit into all these great power relations, mostly right, mostly great power relations, geopolitical relations. And there are several things that we need to agree on to move on to look into the details of this chapter. First, why the Middle East? First, we need to ask this question. Why the Middle East? What's the place of the Middle East? Why is the Middle East important? Against the background of shale gas revolution, right? Against the background of shale gas revolution. Number one aspect is, I was reading this morning, this very interesting, timely reports from Brookings Institution. It just came out, I think one in March, this one by CSIS in April, right? Both address geopolitics and energy. This title, New Energy, New Geopolitics, right? And this one by Brookings, New Geopolitical Security Consequences of Energy. Same thing, right? So this is really things that a lot of analysts, right, studying. Now, these reports devote a lot of pages to, right, the Middle East, Russia, Middle East, U.S. policy, China. But the way they address the Middle East, this is the way they address. One of these reports, I think, very appropriately, begins with 1947, right? 1947, when after World War II, right after Yalta meeting, U.S. President Roosevelt aboard the USS Quincy, which is an aircraft carrier, right? Huge U.S. aircraft carrier. He is aboard the ship, and that ship sails into the Straits of Hormuz. Then again, another U.S. aircraft carries the King of Saudi, Abdul Aziz something. I mean, he has a long name. The King of Saudi, the founder of Saudi Arabia. Okay, then they meet on the USS Quincy, then sign a historic document. 1947, document about oil security swap. Historic document that still applies to U.S.-Saudi Arabian relations. And the reason why one of these reports begins with that historic moment is that this foundation of U.S.-Saudi relations is now coming crumbling down. Right? That foundation, U.S.-Saudi relations, that was founded on the ship of USS Quincy, right? That foundation, U.S.-Saudi relations are coming crumbling down. That's the assumption. Is it coming crumbling down? So U.S.-Saudi Arabia relations, right, is at a very critical moment because of shale gas revolution, right? And the implication of these U.S.-Saudi relations shifting, I think the implication of that, well, I think another episode. Again, moving fast forward to 2013. Again, the Minister of Saudi Arabia, right? One of these report again discusses the Minister of Saudi Arabia in charge of security affairs. He blamed the U.S. government for not letting the Saudi government know the U.S. decision to strike a huge deal between U.S. and Iranian nuclear programs. in March. Right? What does this mean? I mean, one of these changes, I mean, America is having a problem with Saudi Arabia. Then the U.S. is hinting possibility of sort of resolving long-standing U.S.-Iranian nuclear problem. So the question a lot of analysts are struggling with is, where is U.S. policy in the Middle East, right, going? Is the United States going to dump Saudi Arabia, then resolve Iranian nuclear problem, then open Iranian oil exports? Then America again was a little bit sidelined by over Syrian conflicts, right? Putin and Russia was playing a central role. Then America sort of a little bit sidelined, maybe on purpose. So again, the question is America withdrawing from the Middle East, Middle Eastern affairs? The assumption being, because America is becoming energy independent, America doesn't care what will happen in the Middle East, right, compared to the previous years. Then instead, is China going to become sort of a caretaker for Middle Eastern affairs? So all these security great power relations, and a lot of reports look into these issues, but many come to a conclusion that there is still a lot of uncertainty about the U.S. energy independence by 2030. IEA economist Fatih Birol, he even suggests that the fact that we elevate this possibility of U.S. becoming energy independent by 2030 is even damaging in terms of foreign investment into the Middle East, because the Middle East still remain the major oil-producing region. If America spreads out these rumors that, right, U.S. surpassed Saudi Arabia as #1 natural gas producer, and maybe same for oil production, that is not an appropriate sort of a policy. That's the Turkish IEA chief economist argument, because still many more investment flow into the Middle East in terms of global energy sort of stability. So that is problematic. But this article, if you read this article, despite all these sort of pros and cons, and nobody knows where American policy is really going, but there are clearly some signs, right? There are some signs that American policy, right, regarding the Middle East is clearly shifting. There are some signs, right? The evidence, right, here and there, right? Iranian affairs, Syrian affairs, and U.S. drawdown in Afghanistan, right? Withdrawal from Iraq, right? So some indications of some changes are on the way in terms of how America sees the Middle East, right? But despite all these, signs, the official American position, American government view on this is that, there are 3 reasons. I mean, this chapter gives good 3 reasons, right, why America must keep engaged in the Middle East, right? There are 3 reasons. This textbook gives good 3 reasons, right, why America continue to be engaged in the Middle East. Or should America be engaged in the Middle East, right? Number one reason I think this textbook gives, what's the number one reason why America will be engaged? Number one reason is the notion of U.S. energy independence, right, is problematic. The notion of U.S. energy independence, right, it's problematic. There are different ways of looking at it, right? The conception of U.S. energy independence is subject to a lot of different interpretations, right? He even argues that it's a rhetoric, right? It's a rhetoric rather than substantial, right? So you might want to look into that concept. There are different phases of U.S. energy independence. U.S. becoming energy independent by 2030. First, we need to understand clearly what that means, right? Then I think next step is then what changes will that, right, bring to international affairs, great power relations. I think that nothing is more important than this. Looking at global affairs today, nothing is more important than this issue, because there are so many changes. And if you read this chapter and if you read these reports, there's serious changes on the way due to simply the energy revolution in the United States. And I don't know, U.S. energy independence. 2009, America surpassed, Russia as a natural gas producer, and according to some projections, by 2017, right, America is going to surpass Saudi Arabia as an oil producer. That's the figures, at least, on the table. But we need to sort of interpret it from different perspectives. Why this author says that that's rhetoric rather than substance is that again it comes back to the role of Saudi Arabia has played, right? We need to understand the role of Saudi Arabia in the oil market, and I think that I think we need to first put two countries in parallel: Russia, Saudi Arabia. Right? Look at them at the same time. Right? The role of Russia as an oil producer. Second, natural gas producer. Right? We need to understand it first. Right? Then we need to understand Saudi Arabia, mostly as a oil producer, not natural gas in this case. Right? Then when America becomes energy independent, then what will happen to both of these countries, right? That's the next step. What will happen to Russia, right? There are already a lot of things are happening to Russia, right? You know that, right? Ukraine, that's the, I think, outcome of all these changes. And some even argue that impending collapse of Russia, due to energy changes. Then this chapter raises the question of, right, prospect for Saudi Arabia, right? Prospect of Saudi Arabia as an oil producer. The entire oil market changes, right? It's interesting. It's interesting. One of the big trends about both of these countries, Russia, Saudi Arabia, due to U.S. shale revolution, both of these countries, number one, right? Both of these countries, right? Clearly, they are shifting their energy strategies, or energy flows, but both of them focus on the East Asian market. This is one of the most outstanding kind of arguments here and there. Russia looks east. Okay, we have discussed this a lot of times, right? Russia looks east, right? Losing European market, right? Same thing. Saudi Arabia, they emphasize new ties to Asian markets. New ties to Asian markets. So I think that one of the things that we need to study more about Saudi Arabia in terms of energy flows, energy strategy is that what kind of like a new business deals, investments, or political ties between Saudi Arabia and East Asian countries, right? Particularly China. China-Saudi Arabian relations. These are the things that we need to look more. China-Saudi Arabian relations. Is China investing more into the Middle East in general, and into Saudi Arabia in particular? Right? Good research topic. Right? More importantly, I think U.S.-Saudi relations, like I said, the oil security swap kind of deal. That deal, signed 1947, was America provides security, right? Then Saudi Arabia provides oil, right? Now, the question is China able to provide kind of a similar security protection, right? After America, I mean, hypothetically, after America withdraws from the Middle East, is China able to provide sort of a similar security protections, right? Countries in this region, including, right, sea lanes protection. That is important, right? And also investment. What are the movements of Japan, right? What are the movements of Korea, right? These are the things that we need to look more. I still don't know. I mean, if you put together all the puzzles here and there, I think there is emerging some coherent, like a picture where clearly America is pivoting to Asia, right, and leaving you know, the greater Middle East, Central Asia, right? The entire huge, right, chunk of region to sort of China, because China is making a lot of security inroads into Central Asia, you know, Afghanistan, right? Iraq is also here, right? And also in the Middle East. And second reason I think this chapter gives, second reason why America will be engaged in the Middle East is that the oil market is still connected. The local market and the global market still connected. So even if America becomes energy independent, right, the American market will be affected by changes in the Middle East, right? So American market is not free from disruptions of supplies from the Middle East region, right? Because the oil market is truly globalized. And the third reason I think this chapter gives is America still, the America remains the world's only global superpower. So America doesn't have the luxury to leave the affairs of the Middle East to some other countries, right? Like China. In fact, I think we need to sort of carefully watch. The readings I have. I read a lot of newspapers from different countries. Kind of a sense I get from reading all these different newspaper articles. It's not about simply energy, but about energy and security, all the economic changes, everything. Then the impression I get from all these different newspaper articles is that the notion of declining America is clearly disappearing nowadays. I'm not saying America is truly, like he suggested, truly one global superpower. Is that, but clearly the declining America, right, is disappearing. Second, there are a lot of articles. I have read several this morning also. There are a lot of articles that addresses problems with the Chinese economy. Right? This is in sharp contrast to the rise of China, discourse of rise of China, maybe several years ago. Right? I'm not saying all these are due to shale gas, but clearly some changes, right, around us. Right? What was the other thing? Oh, the other thing. Then this chapter goes on to cover Iran, right? Iraq, right? Then chapter 11, all these North African countries, Libya, Algeria, right? Then the way I think this is better way of understanding this. First, I think there is Russia, Saudi Arabia, right? And there are smaller oil producers, many in North African countries, right? Including Iran, Iraq. Iran, Iraq is huge producers. The question is this. First, I think we need to clearly understand, what will happen to Russia and Saudi Arabia. Then, all these smaller producers, right, in North African countries, which have been in political crisis, Arab Spring several years ago. The question is, all these countries, they rely pretty much on raw materials exports, right? And some of these countries, due to political crisis, their exports are reduced, right? And it might reduce more in the future, right? Because of this shale gas revolution, Western countries, they reduce imports. Then the question is, these smaller exporting countries, somehow they need to reform their economies, right? So that they no longer rely on raw materials exports, right? Then without raw materials exports, then how can they, right, continue to develop their economies, right? Standalone economies. So all this question, although this chapter doesn't address that, all this question I think comes back to this huge research question about resource curse. Resource curse. There's a huge literature about the resource curse. How do I begin this topic? The resource curse. I think that this chapter, it's not only about U.S.-Saudi Arabian security relations. This chapter argues that Saudi Arabia might have to, reform the internal system, right? Maybe in the unconventional age, the Saudi economy and the Saudi Arabian political system cannot move on, right? The way it is, right? Then, will Saudi Arabia sort of reform the system? Because, they have to do it because their internal energy consumption is growing, right? And some of the sectors of society, they are investing a lot of money into non-fossil fuel energy, right? Like a solar power and renewable energy, right? So Saudi government is preparing for that transition, in a sense. And politically, this chapter discusses, Saudi is in some kind of a transition to, right? Sort of to the next leadership that will pose a lot of challenges to the Saudi government. So Saudi is sort of a sandwich between this external, right, due to shale gas revolution, external U.S.-Saudi Arabian relations, shifts. Then internally, these, political demands, new political demands, and economic changes, and sort of reduce the resource curse, right? The resource curse issue is probably the most important, serious challenges facing these raw material-based economies, right? Same goes for Russia. Russia has the same problem. I think, in that sense, I think shale gas is a blessing for Western countries, because without the impact such as this, Russia will go on, right? Putin is going to run the Russian economy exactly the same way, even maybe 100 years later, right? So I think Putin somehow he has to change the system, right? And maybe Saudi Arabia and all these North African economies. Then from analytical perspective, then what we have to do is, first I think we need to first look into these different economies. They are all depend on raw material exports, right? Oil and gas. They all depend on raw material exports, but we need to see, the ratio of the dependence. Different, oil exporting countries have different dependency rate, right? Some countries, Saudi Arabia, 90%, right? Their dependency rate, right? Resource dependency rate, 90%. Russia, 50%. Right? This may be convenient for you to remember. Russia, 50% dependent on energy exports, right? Out of 50, okay? Out of 50, 80% for oil exports. 20% natural gas. This is Russian profile. Saudi Arabia, 90% for oil exports, right? And Algeria, Libya, right? Iran, Iraq, and how many, what are other countries in North Africa? There are so many different North African countries, right? Egypt, right? And all these economies have different dependency rate, foreign policy. 2006 by Thomas Friedman, which was written 2006, but the implication for today's energy affairs is so significant. So that's why I pulled up this article. This thesis, the first law of petropolitics, that is suggested by the author of this article, the first law of petropolitics. The author, Thomas Friedman. He was famous New York Times columnist at that time. He wrote many books, including Lexus and the Olive Tree. What is first law of petropolitics? This is the first law of petropolitics. He begins with this interesting anecdotes. He observed the comments by Iranian president, the president of Venezuela, the president of Colombia, Nigeria, and he found something in common, right? About these different leaders, including Putin. Hugo Chavez, we have Iranian president Vladimir Putin, right? They become very nationalistic, anti-Western, right? Very confident about their system. They think that they can become #1 richest country relying on oil exports. They were so confident about their resource riches, right? Including Putin, Iranian president, Colombian president, Nigerian president, right? Then he found this principle, hypothesis, which is sort of this shows the nature of political system, right? Or audacity of the leaders of these oil exporting countries and level of oil price. Okay? So he tried to find some correlation between the nature of their political system, then oil price movement, right? Then the lower the oil price, his theory, the first law of petropolitics, the lower the oil price, the more open the political system, or the more open meaning the more democratic, the more pro-Western, right? This is a problematic aspect, but the more Western, the more democratic, right? The more open, the lower the oil price, right? So 1989, sort of a Berlin Wall came crumbling down, right? Putin opened the Eastern European countries. Then Nigeria privatized oil fields, right? Welcome foreign investment into Nigerian oil production. This happened because oil price was low, according to him, right? And even Iranian, they called for some dialogue with Western countries. Right? That was only up to 1997. Right? Things began to change when oil price began to spike up. Things began to be very different when oil prices began to go up. Then you have changes in Iranian attitudes toward various things. So Iran called for Israel's destruction. Right? Iran becomes much more anti-Western. Right? Sort of. Putin also same thing. Right? Putin becomes very anti-Western. Right? Like a former Soviet, like a FSB style, right? Nationalistic. So this is his theory. This is first law of petropolitics. In fact, Putin became president here, right? 1999. I think this is correct. Oil price began to spike up, right? After 1999. Here. This shows, again, right, the Iranian position on nuclear programs and oil price movement, right? And Khatami was elected president here, right, and becoming much more, right? Chavez. Again, Chavez. Venezuela is a very interesting, case where before oil prices went up, and Chavez, coup failed here. Then, until this time, Venezuela was very open to foreign investment. Right? So privatization of oil fields explains sort of a period before 1999, right? Then Chavez elected almost at the same time, 1999, right? Then sort of his challenge to the Western system, right? Putin. Putin elected 1999, right? Same thing. Then Putin began to nationalize oil companies, right? And one of the biggest private oil companies at that time, Yukos, president of Yukos, Hodorovsky, was arrested 2003. This was the, I think, peak of sort of a Russian, resource nationalism. I think Nigeria follows very similar curve here. And this is a very interesting article, but what all this means, according to his theory, is that the only exception to this is that Bahrain, right? Countries like Bahrain simply their oil resources was depleted at some point. Then their economic reform, political system will drastically change. So what all this means is that resource abundance is very ironic. I mean, the fact that a country has abundant resources from political perspective is counterproductive, right? In terms of explaining why certain economies are more successful than others, I think many scholars take the examples of Asian economies, right? The Asia-Pacific economies, including Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, right? These rapidly developing Asian tigers. Why are they successful? And oftentimes these successful Asian economic tigers are compared to Latin American economies, right? Latin American economies. I think in terms of development timing, I think Latin American economies began economic development earlier than East Asian countries. Latin American economies, I think, their main economic development projects began in the 1970s, right? And in the 80s, Asian countries followed, but very different outcomes, right? Latin American economic development and Asian economic development. And here is the contrast, right? I mean, what explains Latin American failures? Some of you might raise questions. I mean, is Latin America really a case of economic failures? Right? Some might raise questions, but in terms of, although Asian countries, including Korea, has problems, we have problems, but in terms of at least the level of debts and basic social services, infrastructure, I think more or less Asian economies are more successful than Latin American economies. The reason being, there are many ways of explaining this contrast between Latin America and Asian economies. Many point to this aspect. In other words, Latin American economies, their economies were less successful because they relied on raw materials exports. And Asian economies, maybe this is oversimplification, there are many other factors, but simplify a little bit. Asian economies, they lack natural resources, right? So this resource curse theory, right? This resource curse theory, which is enormous body of literature. There's an enormous body of literature, spanning from economics, political science, sociology, maybe other neighboring disciplines. There's a huge field, and all these different disciplines studied this very interesting question, right? Very interesting. Why resource abundance is counterproductive, right? Why resource abundance is counterproductive? More important question is, what is the best way of using resources in a smarter way? Can we leverage resource abundance to become the engine of economic growth, right? But unfortunately, look at different examples from Saudi to, right, North Africa. Look at all these different economies. I think Russia is a very good example. Very, very, I think, classical example of why countries, when they rely on raw materials, their economic system is distorted, but not only economic system, but also political system. The point he makes, Thomas Friedman, his main point is a very good point. Oil price movement and dictatorship, a democracy, there is a opposite direction, opposite correlation, right? So higher oil prices, right, helps dictators, right? That's his theory. So resource abundance, I think, right, helps dictators to take root, right? So economically counterproductive and politically counterproductive. Economic problems due to resource abundance was relatively discovered earlier. but political distortions discovered relatively recent times, right? Political distortions. And why a country relies on resource exports, why politics becomes, right? Why politics becomes dictatorial. Economics, we can understand why economically it is problematic when a country relies on resource exports. You know that, which is known as Dutch disease. That's known as Dutch disease, right? Because the government of the Netherlands discovered it first. The government of Netherlands discovered the distortion of economy, right? When an economy relies on raw materials exports. The Netherlands discovered it first in the 1960s. You know why, right? You know why the Netherlands? Netherlands at that time discovered a huge natural gas reserves in the North Sea, right? And when they began to export natural gas, and the revenues, enormous amount of revenues from natural gas exports, the Dutch economy becomes very much distorted. And that was in the 60s, right? The 60s. So economic problem of resource abundance is Dutch disease, economic distortion. And what are these economic distortions? What happens when you rely on resource exports? Russia has this problem, Saudi has this problem, right? And Algeria has this problem. All these economies, Egypt has it. But it varies depending on the dependency rate, because different economies have different dependence rate. The more you dependent on resource exports, distortion is greater. Right? And Russian dependence, you can imagine, 50%. Saudi, 90%. North Africa, Algeria, all these economies, much lower. Much lower. And the key question, I think, for this chapter is first, Saudi-U.S. security relations. That's one aspect, right? To learn from this chapter. Saudi-U.S. security relations. What will happen? What happens if the U.S. dumps Saudi Arabia, right? And U.S. improves relations with Iran, right? Those issues, right? And what happens if China improves ties with Middle Eastern countries? Those are security questions. The other aspect of this chapter is resource, Dutch disease kind of a aspect. That's the second important question this chapter raises. How is Saudi Arabia going to resolve their resource dependence issue? Or how are North African economies, right, after shale gas, how are they going to reform their economies, right? Are they going to reduce their dependence on resource exports? Then, if you want to reduce dependence on resource exports, then you need to develop manufacturing industries, right? Manufacturing industries. Then, this applies to North African countries, Algeria, Egypt. Egypt, more or less developing those manufacturing base, Egypt, right? So Russia, I mean, is Russia going to develop, right, non-oil, non-natural gas industries, right? is Putin able to do that? Right? I think the lesson for Russia, the lesson of U.S. shale gas is exactly this. Russia must diversify their economies. Right? Shale gas challenge, the best way Russia can challenge this shale gas revolution is to diversify their economies. That's the best way to confront this U.S. shale gas challenge. Russia must diversify their economies and develop manufacturing base, right? Non-oil, non-fossil fuel based economies. Kazakhstan, same thing. So if you read major government announcements coming out of these regions, they have a lot of policy components, such as including diversification, industrial base, develop industrial base, which is not easy, right? Which is not easy. So when scholars study these resource curse issues, we first compare the economies of different resource exporting countries, then look at different dependency ratio, right? Then different bases of manufacturing industries. But if you look at the Middle East and North Africa a little bit better than the Middle East. I think the larger theme for both Middle East, North Africa after shale gas, the larger theme is not actually manufacturing development, but larger theme, the way things go currently at the moment is these governments in the Middle East and North Africa, they are rapidly becoming a region of failing states. That's the image you get, right? So it's a very tragic situation. So the impact of shale gas on the Middle East and North Africa, I think in principle, yes. In principle, Thomas Friedman is right. Because oil market is changing, prices are going down, right? So then, according to the first law of petropolitics, their political system, the leaders must be awakened to, right, the reality. Then they open up the system, and politics becomes more democratic, right? Open elections, right? Because they realize they cannot rely on high oil prices, right? They know that. Then they sort of begin to change the system, reform the system, right? Because that's what, right? The law, right? When prices are low, systems become democratic, open, right? So shale gas, I think the impact in theory is to make these regimes in North Africa and Middle Eastern much more democratic, according to theory. Right? Much more democratic, much more industrial based, rather than oil exports. Right? But at the moment, I think the reality is that, particularly Iraq, Iran, right? Iraq, Iran, they're a huge country. The prospect is very bleak in these countries. North Africa, a little bit brighter than Iran and Iraq. Right, some diversification. I can show you some tables here. Some diversification going on in North African countries, particularly Egypt. If you look at figures for Egypt, their dependency is pretty much low, right? Very much low, right? Some prospect there in North Africa, right? we can expect some industrialization. Right? Interestingly, Russia, Saudi Arabia. Do you know how they compare Russia, Saudi Arabia? The way they compare Russia and Saudi Arabia is that maybe better to look at, MENA, North Africa, Middle East combined to be called MENA, Middle East and North Africa. MENA region, a lot of interesting tables. There are a lot of studies. Like this table. There's the index of export diversification. Right? This shows how many different, like a non-oil, non-gas export items these countries have. This index shows, right? And across times, right? From the 80s to the 90s and 2000s. It'll be interesting if we have updated information currently, 2000s. So Algeria, Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Libya, Morocco, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, they have all, right, different figures, right? This is what we do. We look at these different exporting countries, right? Different dependency rate and prospects for diversification. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya. These are high oil dependent countries. Libya, very much dependent. Right? Oman, very much dependent, 90%. Saudi, right? These are highly dependent countries. And different commodities these different countries are specializing in. Right? Almost, if not oil and gas, they mostly specialize in the exports of agricultural items, very small agricultural items. Like, we talk about Algeria, Bahrain, very pathetic items you have for exports. So we can barely talk about sort of an industrialization for these economies. And I want to show you this one. Very interesting report. This one by Brookings. You must read it. If not for this class, you must read it maybe later after this semester. Now, we have here. This shows, right, who are top exporters to the United States. This figure shows, right? We already know, right? Canada is the biggest exporter to the United States. Then comes Saudi, right? Then comes Mexico, Venezuela. Look at Nigeria here. As top number 4 exporter to the United States, oil, Nigeria, there's a drastic drop in exports. Even a steeper drop after this point. Because after this point, U.S. shale oil begins to be produced much more. And quality of oil produced from shale, U.S. shale, same as Nigerian oil. So there's a lot of displacement, particularly for Nigeria, right? So Saudi comes next, right? Second. But Saudi, there's a drop, right? There's a drop. This is a sort of a problem we were discussing. And the table I wanted to show you is this. Oh, maybe the other report. Right, the other report. It's amazing. I mean, U.S. think tanks, they're amazing because it's very difficult to write up this kind of a very timely report in the time span of 1 or 2 months, because these are really ongoing, currently developing issues. They release these reports, right? Amazing. I mean, I was preparing on this, but they released this first, much earlier than I do. Oh, where was the very important table? Oh, here. Here. Look at this. It's a very interesting figure, which shows the level of break-even oil prices for different countries. Right? What we can interpret from this figure is that this is break-even price, right? Who is performing, underperforming or overperforming compared to break-even price? If you look at this, Russia, Saudi Arabia, I think a little bit different, right? These two most important oil producers in the age of unconventional shale oil era, the two most important oil producers, they might have different fortunes because of these different economics. The economics facing Russia much more unfavorable than the economics facing Saudi Arabia. In other words, prices, cost of oil production, higher, much higher in Russia than in Saudi Arabia, which we can expect, right? And in terms of, I think we also have to include population size. Population size, much bigger here in Russia. Saudi, much smaller, which means price pressures coming from the US, the unconventional price pressures, when Russia and Saudi Arabia confront Russian US price pressures, Saudi Arabia might be able to sustain itself for much longer period of time because of this economics. But Russia might not be able to sustain themselves for as long as Saudi Arabia can, right? So this is, I think, what this kind of research will be. There will be many more research such as this in the future. Comparison of different production profiles of Russia and Saudi Arabia. And Iran is an interesting country, Iran, because the potential there is enormous. Potential. I mean, this chapter discusses potential in Iran, enormous. America is opening, right? Particularly natural gas, right? Both natural gas and oil, because Iran both abundant in both oil and natural gas. And oil, I think interesting dynamics in Iran, because Iran's significant producer already, but sanctions, right? Sanctions suppressing Iranian production. But when sanctions are lifted, Iranian oil production will increase. And Iran, I think, came to the negotiating table over nuclear programs because, like I said, I mentioned this earlier in previous classes, the fact that U.S. produces a lot of shale oil, 2.3 million barrels. 2.3 million barrels of oil America produces. That, I think, in and of itself, made Iran to come to the negotiating table, because without U.S. 2.3 million shale oil production, Iran was able to sort of resist, because their impact on oil markets, right? 20% of oil prices, they can change, right? Because of shale oil production in the U.S., Iran lost that leverage. Right? I mentioned this earlier, right? That's one of the huge geopolitical impacts. And Iraq, I think, again, you need to read the discussions about Iraq, because Iraq, you know all, right, about Iraq. I mean, why the war raged in Iraq. There were many discussions about, oil was behind the Iraqi war. And this chapter discusses Iran has huge potential in terms of oil production. Even projections differ, but even some argue that Iran can produce 10 million barrels maximum, which is almost similar to Saudi Arabia production. But the only problem facing Iraq, this chapter discusses, because of the several rounds of wars, all the infrastructure, right? The facilities are all destructed, right? Roads, infrastructure, all these are destructed. That will continue to be a hurdle to, right, oil production and exports. That's the major problem in Iraq. Right. I mean, I think America has responsibility to put in place some governance structure where, because all these changes, shale gas changes, impact, geopolitical changes, economic changes are still ongoing. We never know which way, right? These changes will go, but America is the origin of technology, and America is probably the biggest stakeholder in all this. Then they must put in place a system, a structure where formerly oil-dependent economies, right? They are stranded, right? They are stranded. It's quite clear. MENA region, economies in MENA region, right? Some are big, some are small producers, right? Saudi, relatively in better position. Qatar, very good position, right? But there are many more smaller exporters, oil-dependent economies that are really stranded, right? Neither, they might not be able to export, right, oil and gas, but they're not quite diversified, right? So we can expect many of these MENA countries to be in a very chaotic situation. So I think the World Bank, IMF, and many responsible institutions, global institutions, they have to convene experts, right, from various fields to study the future economic development strategies for these formerly oil-dependent economies. I think it's time to have this kind of a system, governance system, then so that these countries make a smooth transition to post, whatever you call, post maybe fossil fuel, because these economies must make a transition to, right, non-oil, non-natural gas, like industry or economy. So America must be having some type of a system. This is very urgent problem because MENA already, we see a lot of problems there coming from this region. You know, Arab Spring, these are one of these problems. And because of these political problems, right, there's a huge disruptions. Oil supply, 2.3 million disruptions from MENA region. Luckily, America fills the gap now, right? America oil production fills the gap. That's why oil price relatively stable currently, right? So I think that's the focus of this chapter, and this is very important issue, global governance issue. We'll continue next Monday.